parties and organizations. She is also co-author of The Politics of Poverty Relief, Strategies of Vote Buying and Social Policies in Mexico, co-authored with Alberto Diaz-Cairos and Federico Esteves, published also by Cambridge in 2016. Her award-winning research has been published in leading journals, including AVSR, AGPS, World Development, CPS, and others. Her work has received wide international acclaim. She was the 2023 winner of the prestigious Stockholm Prize in Criminology, the most prestigious international academic award in the field of criminology. The award recognized her extensive research in Mexico and Brazil, which shows how public support for police militarization can challenge human rights without increasing public safety. Beatriz, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Beatriz will be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes or so, after which we will open it up for discussion. Beatriz, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for that so kind introduction. For great. I think it's the most amazing introduction. And thanks everyone for being here. I can also see a lot of people here in the community who have been very essential for a lot of the work that I have been doing for the years here at Stanford, based at CPPL. So I want to thank everyone for that. And I'm going to present today a part of my work that maybe it's not that well known. I have been working on indigenous governance for a long time. And originally that was focused on the provision of livelihoods by indigenous communities in Mexico and accountability. And increasingly, because I focus a lot on violence, my work on indigenous governance has focused on these problems. So it's not that's the title of the paper. It's called from Beatriz Magaloni and Sarah Thompson. Sarah is a PhD student here at political science and also a member of the lab. And she has a amazing work on Pakistan on related issues of governance and governance. We're very proud of her. And so let me begin by this introduction around the nature of the state. So traditionally, we conceive the monopoly of violence as a solution to a lot of problems, including economic development and the literature attributes violence in the developing world to state weakness, rough terrain, and poverty. But in this paper, we offer an alternative view of states as predatory, as extensions of criminality, rather than solutions to it. States that turn or allow violence against their citizens. We focus on one solution to this dilemma of what we call state-sponsored predatory criminal war, which is territorial political autonomy. It is a form of selectively opting out from the state. And I will say what that means. It's interesting, the slides here don't go with the slides.
Oh, there might be a little bit of a lag.
Yeah, it's kind of sorry about that. So I recognize that in many areas of the developing world, organized criminal groups collaborate with the state. They normally convince the state to violate intelligence, protection, and impunity. And sometimes these criminals can be relatively peaceful and benign. A lot of my work has shown that in the context of Mexico and Brazil. Criminal groups can also be highly predatory. Criminals can use murder, the looting of natural resources, sexual violence, and heavy extort with population. These atrocities normally are committed or perpetrated with the full backing of the state and its law enforcement apparatus. So examples of state-sponsored predatory criminal rule are all over the world. So, for example, we focus on Colombian paramilitary groups. They institutionalize their influence by penetrating and infiltrating into the state, especially its legislatures, and have representation in the legislature so that they could really get laws to protect them and violate impunity for murdering civilians and committing a lot of gross offenses. In Rio de Janeiro, the militias, which are former police officers, prison guards, and fire originally emerged to provide security to their communities, but they eventually morphed into really very large criminal enterprises that profit on, for example, real estate, extortion, monopolies of provision of public services. And they do that with the full collaboration, again, of the state, especially by the way in which they buy their influence in the legislature. And the same thing in Mexico. Mexican cartels infiltrate local governments, specifically by funding political campaigns and attacking or killing any political candidate who refuses to get oral or who works with a criminal rival. I don't know if you've been following the elections this year in Mexico, but there have been so many candidates who have been murdered by criminal groups. In these cases that I cite here, it's interesting to note that the Western form of selecting leaders, which is multi-party elections, is one vehicle to which these armed groups fit in place. One solution to this quandary, throughout history has been to simply evade the state, and Scott has amazing work showing how that happens. But in the current period, it's very hard to really find spaces with the technology and the reach of states, even in current government areas, are significantly, this solution is significantly hard to find. Civilians also, of course, can migrate. This is very costly because when they migrate from one place, they're also preyed by voluntary organizations. Another solution has been vigilante justice. Sorry about that, but it's just not, I think it was converted. I said really clear. So I'm going to pop it here. Sorry. So another solution has been vigilante justice. There are counter-insurgency militias, counter-crime militias, and counter-rival militias. And unfortunately, many of these groups are guilty in atrocities against the population. In the case of Mexico, there is a very famous movement that is called the autodefensas that emerged in various states in Mexico, very prominently in Michoacan, where local communities and especially armed men organize defense against the state, the criminal groups under collaboration with the state. And many of these autodefensas eventually were infiltrated by criminal groups and we established very predatory forms of rule. So this data could be a great solution. So we propose here another solution, which is local territorial that allow indigenous in Mexico and other Latin American countries to gain a sense of autonomy from the state. This is available to around 17 million in Mexico. 29% of municipalities in Mexico have more than 30% of indigenous peoples and 25% more than 50%. So there is a large percentage of municipalities with this institutional solution applied. And again, I also want to emphasize that many of these municipalities share ancestral governance practices that are highly participatory, and I'll talk about those. And many of these governance practices date back to colonial times. And I'll talk a little bit later about the pueblos indígenas and how that identify the effects of this political autonomy. So this is not always something happening in Mexico. In Latin America, there has been a very important movement towards recognizing indigenous autonomous rights. Autonomy is generally assumed as a promising model to protect indigenous communities because they open a space for self-rule within the nation state. Unfortunately, relatively is known about how this solution can help indigenous communities and their territories protect their territories and their communities. I should say that this is not only an institution present in Mexico. Many states worldwide recognize self-determination rights for traditional authorities. So there is this very interesting work and data set by Goldman and Poissinger that shows that around 35% of the world has some form of indigenous or traditional autonomy recognition in their constitutions. But I just want to emphasize that in contrast to many to chiefs in many African countries that are selected for life by a council, indigenous authorities in Mexico are significantly more democratic. There is a very high degree of social embeddedness due to the fact that a lot of these indigenous leaders get elected by servicing the community in the system of cargos, which are called community obligations. So you participate, for example, at the beginning in being a police for the community, and then from there you move into being the one that is in charge of the schools, and then you move ahead, and then you are going to be in charge of public provision and provision of water. Then you move ahead and you participate in the system of justice. And those who are elected as municipal presidents normally have a very long tradition of servicing the community. And the second reason why they are significantly more democratic is that the community assembly is the ultimate power. So they select the leader. The leader is there for 3 years. It's not there for life. And then the leader goes back to his community or her community. And the community can even sort of overthrow the traditional leader if he or she is not performing well. And that does not happen in places that have party selection of municipal president. And let me talk a little bit about the various forms. So there are very many forms of indigenous autonomy in Mexico that I, reported papers. So the concept of autonomy in Mexico was made very popular by the Zapatista uprising in 1994. And the Zapatistas really rose in arms against the state with a lot of demands. One of them was gaining an autonomy, but the FISA courts collapsed, and the government never gave recognition to this community. And they continue to have around 6 municipalities that are called caracoles, that are autonomous from the state, but they are not formally recognized. They are in a form of rebel autonomy. And what this has implied is that the communities completely detached from the state. And one of the dilemmas is that they are not receiving any government transfers, field transfers from the federal government. So one of the negative consequences of this form of autonomy has been perpetuating poverty. But there are other forms of autonomy happening in Mexico, and the one I'm going to be focusing on is on legalized territorial political autonomy that is very prevalent specifically in the state of Oaxaca, but is expanding today to other states. And here, the state and the constitution of the state recognizes autonomy of indigenous communities at the municipal level. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But there is other forms of autonomy. For example, there is this very interesting trans-regional community police in the state of Guerrero. We were there, by the way, around 6 months ago. The state of Guerrero is a place where literally is almost impossible to do research because of how dangerous it is. Yeah. The levels of violence there are just incredible. That's where the Ayotzinapa massacre of the students took place. But we were in the area of indigenous governance in La Montaña, so we could literally not even drive at night during in the road. So that's the type of protection that these communities can offer when they gain this autonomy. And in the case of the track, unfortunately, it's not recognized politically by the state. So they are constantly fighting with municipalities and with the state of Guerrero to recognize the community police. And often the police is sent to prison and they have negotiations. And currently there is a fight within the Supreme Court about the legality of that. So it's not the type of autonomy that I'm going to be talking about, that it's legally recognized, fully recognized. Okay. So what does territorial political autonomy in Oaxaca means? So the first thing is that they ban from competing in local elections. And the mayor is selected through community assemblies. The community not only meets regularly to select the mayor, but literally they meet regularly to take every major decision. Every man, and increasingly women, 80% of the communities that we studied in a large survey in 2000, there was participation of women, and now it is in the Constitution written that women must be given the right to participate in every community. As I say, the community assembly is the ultimate authority, and we saw a lot of cases in which they actually scrutinize very closely the municipal president, and they can actually get rid of a president that has corrupt deals with organized criminal groups. And then there is a parallel system of justice and a community police detached from the state. And this is very important because the local state institutions of law enforcement are normally where the criminal groups get infiltrated. So here, the community police is run by members of the community. When you are 18, you are forced to participate as a community police member. It's not through your life. You participate for years and then you go to other positions. So it's kind of costly for the community to be able to sustain all these participations. And then a very important part that I don't underscore here, but it's super important in terms of the power these communities are given. The administrative legal jurisdiction corresponds to the municipality. What it means is that municipalities that are indigenous and autonomous still receive federal transfers from the state. So the state cannot punish indigenous communities for opting out from the party system. Or the state cannot, if you are, let's say now the president from Morena, they cannot really punish indigenous communities for not being with the party. And that is a very important characteristic. Okay, so the main research question is whether these indigenous communities that are ruled through political autonomous institutions can provide better security against cartel takeover than the conventional state judicial and police systems. And this is a picture I took in the municipality in the Níger region of Oaxaca. And this is the municipal presidency. And this is the convoy, which is a really mythical figure that saved a lot of these members from in the Spanish conquest. And there is the belief that they still, sort of this mythical figure still is there to protect the communities in the Níger region. So our work is based on extensive field work. Let me see again this much. It's based on extensive field work that I'll detail below. And then our main dependent variable has to do with whether cartels infiltrate and capture municipalities. So obviously to do that is very hard. So we collected this, we created this novel data set looking at local and national news reports, about 7 million nodes, searching for what we call cartel presence. A cartel presence can mean an article that mentions one of the following: assassinations by cartels, mentioning corrupt alliances between a cartel and the local authorities, specifically elaborating that the municipality is an area of influence of the cartel, mentioning that there are security houses or security houses in this municipality, and reporting that a leader of a cartel was arrested or killed in that municipality, like presumably the plaza of the cartel. And then we also use homicide data from vital statistics and various rounds of victimization surveys. So the field work consisted in extensive work in Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Michoacán, and increasingly now in Guerrero, as I mentioned. We collected in-depth interviews with authorities, topiles, autodefensas, farmers, comuneros, and residents. To do that, we rely on a group of indigenous students that Alberto has brought through CAS every summer until COVID, that the program has not been able to continue. And we built this amazing network of indigenous students that now participate in our research, or, we also mentor them to do their own research. So here I took a picture with three of our students actually, and we were in this municipality of Cheran. And I'll talk a little bit about Cheran because it's very important. I'll talk about Cheran in this moment. So Cheran is really interesting because in 2011, the community was being subject to a lot of extortion by a local criminal gang that was associated with the big cartels of Michoacán, La Familia Michoacana. And they were literally ravaging the forest. What they say is that they were taking around 200 trees from the community every single night. And then the community at some point decided it's time for us to really confront the criminals. So the narco group threatened to kill 15 members of the community who were in this disposition to fight them. And the community decided in that moment that they were going to raise in arms. So the entire community, literally women, children, older men, came out to protect the community. They were able to expel the municipal police. And what they explained is that the municipal police was the institution that allowed the criminals to infiltrate the community, and also they expelled the municipal president. And after that, they continued with this movement for a year, in which they lit these bonfires in every corner of the community. And all the community would come out at night to the bonfires to signal to the traffickers that the community was in control. Then they sued the government before the Supreme Court, and they were able to gain legal recognition of their autonomy, which meant the same things that we talked about in Oaxaca. So they can select their own authorities through customary practices. In this case, they select them through 4 barrios that select from assemblies in 4 barrios that select a council of indigenous representatives that are the municipal authority. And then they also have a parallel justice system and police. Just this police system was funded by a lot of the money coming from Michoacan immigrants here in the United States. And the police is very incredibly trained. There are pictures of them climbing literally the church of the town just to get some, training. And they have been able to deter cartels, and now they have one of the lowest homicide rates in the state. So Cheran really symbolizes how the institution that I'm talking about is expanding beyond the state of Oaxaca today. There is an important reform in the state to allow local communities to gain autonomy. And at the moment, there are, I believe, 36 that have gained recognition, and the rest during the electoral process cannot continue, but the rest are really waiting to hear from the authorities that they create. So this is the research sites that we work in. Oaxaca, Chiapas, all these places are highly indigenous. And the main difference is that in Oaxaca is where we find, this is the blue areas, is where we find this institution recognized since 1995. So that's what we were going to be analyzing with data that I will show you in a minute. So why cartels want to capture municipalities, especially small indigenous municipalities? And it has to do with the way cartels have diversified their portfolio of activities. So they focus, of course, on drug trafficking, which is important, but they also extort a lot of illicit activities. For example, avocados, lemons, berries. If you go to Michoacan, that's a lot of what, they are targeting these businesses that generate quite a bit of money. They also invade land and prey on all mining and forestry. As I explained in Xerang, they were looting the natural resources. And in addition, they asked for quotas, and many cartels engage in kidnappings to extract revenue from the local population. So this very complex revenue generation model requires state capture at the local level. And municipal governments are the closest to the communities. And they can provide intelligence, resources, territorial penetration, and institutional protection. So that's why the cartels target municipalities. Here I'm going to go a little bit fast in terms of the 3 mechanisms that we discover in our fieldwork that they use to capture them. So one of them is like in Cheran, they would infiltrate the community through local criminal cells. And these local criminal cells receive money from the cartels, weapons, and they also can use the name of the cartel to deter other criminal organizations. Second, cartels, as I mentioned, capture local governments by specifically targeting them during elections. Why? Because elections are very expensive, and they normally turn to groups that have money to fund these elections. And then this is also very common today in Mexico. They take control of municipalities by just invading communities that are under control of other criminal organizations. I just want to give you 2 points that we received from our field work. that suggests some of the mechanisms that I just mentioned, that I will mention while I'm costumbres of territorial autonomy gives them protection. One of them is saying about the community organization and how the police is run by the community, and says we don't have crime, organized crime, or delinquents here. If we had them, the topiles, who are the community police, would immediately catch them, and they would protect order. But even when they can, they would mobilize the entire community so that we could all come to defend ourselves. So we hear a lot of cases in which there were, for example, criminals invading the community, and then they would the bell of the church, everybody coming out and defending the community, or they can coordinate through walkie-talkies. It is different communities when there is someone coming into the community to do whatever illicit activity. Of course, they also are very well at capturing these local criminals, much better than the very removal from the law enforcement apparatus. And then this is another interview with a sicario from a mid-level sicario in Michoacán. And he says, it is easier to win a war through elections than guns. So that suggests why they target. I mean, seeing a war through fighting, it's very costly for everyone. So I'm going to tell you the hypotheses that we evaluate and some of the challenges of identification. Obviously, this is very hard to identify because Oaxaca could be very unique. There could be some specific characteristics in Oaxaca that are not in other municipalities. For example, Oaxaca could be not particularly attractive to criminal groups because of its geography, or because it's not suitable, for example, for production of drugs. Or Oaxaca could be different because they have these very ancestral governance practices that are not common in other places. And these, rather than the institution itself, is what allows them to expel the cartels. So there are very many challenges of identification. Unfortunately, this is not for us. And also for indigenous people, this is not an institution that has expanded that much across Mexico. So I just mentioned Oaxaca, but also Michoacán. And I think what our results will suggest is that if an idea or a goal is to protect indigenous communities, this could be considered by other states as a solution. And I will try to show you that. So some of the hypotheses that we test is more cartel presence obviously should increase violence. Here we proxy with homicide rates. We expect less cartels presence and less violence in cursos or these traditional autonomous municipalities relative to the ones that are controlled by the parties. And why? But I mean party control is two things. One is that they are selected through the party system, and the other is that they don't have this alternative or parallel system of justice. So any conflict in the community has to go through the municipal police, and any conflict that involves a criminal investigation has to go through the state police, so to the authorities of the state. And this is a very infiltrated institution. So they necessarily have to engage with the law enforcement apparatus, which doesn't happen in the territories that we study. So we also expect lower levels of police corruption and even violence against the citizens in these places than in the ones that are not autonomous. So they sense better, local criminal sense better, and they also should be more effective at deterring other forms of crimes against the community, for example, extortion. So those are the hypotheses that we test. And here is a little bit of how the data looks. These are the municipalities that received funding in 1995. So if you see there were incredibly high levels of homicide rates in those municipalities. This is homicide rate 100,000. These are party municipalities that are larger than 10,000 inhabitants, so hardly comparable with this. And these are the smaller rural municipalities that are more comparable to the municipalities that we are studying. So what you see is after the reform, there is a very sharp decrease in violence in those municipalities. And then this is when the drug war begins in 2006. And there is this massive escalation of violence in Mexico. And you can see that these communities remain with low levels of violence. And the comparable rural municipalities have significantly higher levels of violence. So just this descriptive data suggests that there are very profound differences. And to be able to compare these and try to identify this. We're going to do a lot of different sort of strategies. First, we're going to show you the difference in different models, just that I show you. That the introduction of usos, controlling for all omitted characteristics in municipalities, so using municipalities and their fixed effect, significantly reduce violence in these places. Then we're going to try to compare only comparable municipalities, so highly indigenous, small municipalities with specific characteristics. So most of municipalities might have less, for example, connectivity to the transportation network, which we measure. So we have this measure of connectivity for each cartel, each municipality, and we can know how connected the municipalities are to the transportation network. So we're going to use this matching strategy. Then this is a really more demanding test for us. So we're going to just look at municipalities that are 1 kilometer apart. So this is like a geographic discontinuity approach. 1 kilometer apart, for example, in the border of Oaxaca and Guerrero. So Guerrero, there are very similar municipalities, but they don't have that option of indigenous, rural, but they don't have the option of autonomy. So we are going to use this geographic discontinuity with and without matches. So again, even more stricter, we focus only on indigenous, very similar, and we still produce the same result. Then we're going to look at suitability, specifically on opium. So it might be the case that Oaxaca is not so suitable for opium production like Guerrero, and that is what makes Guerrero more violent. So we construct this measure of how suitable the terrain is for growing poppy, and then we just use external price shocks, obviously coming from the international price of heroin as an identification strategy. And then this is the last set of results. I just presented this paper and it's very good feedback in terms of how do we tease apart these ancestral governance practices that likely these communities have and might not be present in other communities. So we will look at this institution of Pueblos de Indios during colonial times. And then these Pueblos de Indios had a lot of similar practices that were recognized during colonial times. And they have similar autonomy that eventually survived. Some of these practices survived, but are not legally recognized. And so I'm going to hurry very much. This is just to say that Oaxaca, it's not the case that Oaxaca, this is the rest of parties. They have a lot of seizures of opium, marijuana, all drugs, and then suitability is the same in small party municipalities. So this is how many drugs, how much drugs they seize per year. So it looks very similar in both cases. So this is the difference in difference. It goes still not. This is the difference in difference model that I'm sorry I just found it because it was later. I just want to focus on the. So we systematically find a reduction of homicides in these places. In all municipalities, in indigenous municipalities that are 50% indigenous, and then in small municipalities. So we select those so that they are more comparable. And there is a negative sign for the moment in which USO was introduced, controlling for fixed effects and municipality here effect, year effects of municipality fixed effects. We also show that the more cartels you have, the more violence you have. So obviously it's related to criminal groups. And then we interact whether there was any seizure of drugs in the community with the fact of having also. So the advantage of this is that we have, this is time variant, so it varies every year. So when we interacted with those, we find that in places where there is seizures of drugs, but there is also there is significantly less violence. And then you do the same thing for opium, for marijuana, for other drugs. Okay. So I'm going to. You just told me I'm remembering. So this is a matching strategy. I'm not going to go in detail. Then we use the same difference approach, but now we match the municipalities. And again, we use fixed effects for municipality and years. And we are going to apply weights derived from the matching process so that we really sort of compare, the same municipalities. And here I'm just showing the results for cartel presence. So this is the introduction of the USO reform. You don't see much here, but then reduction, and especially after the drug war, you see a significantly less presence of cartels in USO's municipality. Then again, using the matching, it could be the case that the fact that they have less violence is because they, for example, might have only one criminal group controlling the municipality. And we've shown that when that happens, there is less violence than when we have contested wood. So we actually look at that. Here, I'm going to redo for the final paper. So we just focus here on the drug war period, but we can focus obviously on the pre-drug war period. So this would be the long term, short, but we all show that after the drug war, there is more places with monopoly, with contested, and less places with cartels. When we interact that period with users, we significantly show that there is less places with monopoly, less contested, but there is more places with no cartel presence in these localities. So that is a really important, interesting and important finding. Then this is going to be the geographic discontinuity. So obviously Oaxaca might be very different from what is happening in other states. These are right away the municipalities of the propensity score, no one's. But this is what we're going to now compare Oaxaca versus the municipalities that are just 1 kilometer apart. And then we find, again, the same results. It's again a difference in difference. And we're going to show a little bit different here, again, with short-term and long-term effects. But we find in terms of homicides, there is significantly fewer homicides in Oaxaca, and then also significantly fewer cartels in this post-drug war period. But again, we can show it also for the pre-war period. So finally, I'm going to not show you this, but we do the same analysis now with drug suitability and price shocks. So there was obviously this very significant increase in the overdoses from opium in the United States, and that was related to changes in prices of this drug. And then we interact that with, sorry about that, I'm not going to show you the results, but we also find the same results that in also municipalities that are very suitable or equally suitable for production of opium, you have significantly less violence. So there are municipalities that are quite attractive to cartels when prices are increasing and when you have suitable terrain, but then there are significantly fewer homicides and fewer less cartel presence. And then this is the last part of the research that I've been developing literally the last 2 weeks, and I am integrating this. I found Alberto who helped me with the Pueblos de Indios data. He knows everything about colonial time and colonialism in Mexico and beyond. So he shared with me this data on Pueblos de Indios, and here we are focusing on this institution during colonial times that presumably has very similar characteristics in terms of social capital, in terms of practices of self-governance, including, for example, holding assemblies, community police, and so on, but that don't have recognition. And then we just compared those in which there was a Pueblo de Indio that became a cabecera, so the center of power in the municipality, with the Usos municipalities today. And this is for homicide rates, and this is for presence of cartels. And we find very interesting results. So systematically, these are highly indigenous places, more than 50% indigenous, that have this tradition, this institution, but no recognition of the autonomy. And we find that in Usos, there is significantly fewer homicides. Again, this is the effect, and significantly fewer cartels. So I'm going to continue exploring the effect of this because we have some interesting surveys that can show that these Pueblos de Indios do in fact have this tradition. So, community assemblies, police, but they don't have recognition of the autonomy. And then I'm not going to present this. So we also show there is less police violence, there is less extortion, gun presence, drug sales, robbery, these municipalities versus others. So just to conclude, there is really interesting questions about the limits of the state in creating order in this context that the state is captured by local criminal groups. I'm not saying the entire state, but really the local states in Mexico are heavily infiltrated by cartels. So in the context of these predatory regimes, we suggest that indigenous political autonomy can serve as a protection for these communities. this is very relevant for Oaxaca, Mexico in general. As I show, there is a lot of mobilization among communities to gain autonomy today, but it's also relevant beyond Mexico. In Latin America, you look at the constitutions, there is a lot of recognition of autonomy in places like Bolivia, Venezuela, Panama, Colombia, Nicaragua. Obviously, the legalization of this is different from how much the scope of autonomy they have. But I think this paper suggests that giving this scope of political autonomy might be relevant in terms of protection against organized crime. And then just interesting in terms of scope conditions, we had to reflect more, but there is a lot of other places besides Latin America where these institutions of traditional governance are recognized. The institution we're studying is quite democratic, as I mentioned. So I don't know how this will travel, for example, to chiefs in Africa or other places where religious leaders have a lot of autonomy. But I think it's worth really thinking about that. And thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. What an incredible and not only an ambitious and methodologically sophisticated project, but also a project that engages very thoughtfully and in a very socially conscientious way with the local communities and the stakeholders on the ground. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll hold us to them and then we'll defer to the room. I'm keeping a list. So if you have a question, just keep your hand raised and I will recognize you. I'll nod at you. Let's begin with Larry.
Okay, well, thank you, Beatriz. It is amazing research. I actually have two questions. The first is the cartels seem to have been very adaptive and innovative over time. So strategy is brought out and then they find the weak point and adapt. So if this were implemented, widely, how can you imagine that the cartels might adapt to it? And is there a way of anticipating and preempting the adaptation? And the second one may be slightly related, but this is looking at the problem from the standpoint of community protection, say from the ground up locally. But one way of adaptation is you just focus on all the communities that aren't indigenous and don't have this degree of immunity, other than the answer we usually hear, which may be the only answer, is that the United States has to deal with its demand problem. Is there anything else at the nationwide level that Mexico could do that would protect communities generally in Mexico?
Right.
Yeah, why don't we hit that one?
They are super good questions. This question of adaptation is really very important. And I really haven't thought about this. I tell you that, for example, we were interviewed with the Consejo Indígena in Cherán. To get permission to interview with them, we had to literally go 2 or 3 times. 3 times it was to get permission to speak with them and then do research in the community. They finally gave it to us. And they reflected with us about this danger and saying, we don't want to be an example because we are really literally, under siege. I mean, it's very hard to sustain this. You still see Cherán with very low levels of violence, but they recognize how difficult it is. And other communities are joining what we call the Purepecha of rising there. And we don't know how this is going to evolve because in Oaxaca, this has longer tradition. So just establishing this anew, frankly, we will see as this evolves. But I think it's a very important question. And on the other, we focus on Indigenous Mexico here. They have a lot of social capital. Communities are very, there is a lot of social capital that the literature has shown helps for collective action and protection against organized armed groups. But you don't have the same level of social capital everywhere. So, for example, I mentioned the autodefensas. This is more mestizo communities, larger, less indigenous. In some places, there are still maybe some effectiveness. We frankly don't know how to analyze the difference. So Moncada shows, for example, that if the business community is more cohesive in that community, it's the Auto-Defense Act is more effective and less violent against the population. So that's promising, where you have other forms of cohesion that is based on other forms of cooperation. And then, of course, the other alternative is institutional reform that actually works. And that is really very important. So we did research in various states in Mexico. And the case of Monterrey, Nuevo León is a very interesting one, where they actually managed to professionalize the local police. They hired the entire police, municipal, state, every police in the state. They brought men from and women from other states, and they created a system of that they pay them quite well. There is a system of like a civil service type of, where it's not a political position that the chiefs have, but it's really through ascension. And the reform seems to be working well, but I haven't seen this replicated in other states. So obviously the question is, why is it seems to be so complicated? And the current government not attention at all to the problem of violence. So it's a very difficult phenomenon. Opportunity. And yes, I mean, the fact that we're so close to the US and the drug market that is so profitable makes our country very vulnerable. So I wish the US treated this as a health problem and really did something that mattered. It's not just a problem of law or pain, right?
With your permission, Beatriz, can we take 2 questions at a time?
Yes.
Mona?
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you could just elaborate what you were talking about right now in terms of hormones and emotions. You mentioned that there are constitutions that are drafting within these communities for that autonomy, and also the gender aspect of it, that women's participation. I wanted to you could elaborate on that a little bit more. In particular, given the fact that also at the national level, there's a big discourse that I know that usually the local have been more at the forefront of this.
And Andreas?
Thanks so much. This is the fascinating paper. I love both the argument and the fact that you've measured every appearance. Some of the rest of us. I have one question about the theoretical mechanism, I guess. I wonder if from the field work, from the quality of it, you can sort of draw out a bit more. I'd be super curious to hear. I see sort of the main factor here is collective action. But I wonder if it travels primarily from that through coercion. Is it about organizing your own police force to forcibly expel? And I'll go through the more some other mechanisms like negotiating with armed groups or preventing recruitment among them. Something sort of not so much coercion centered, but also draws from the collective action capacity. I think. So if you have any thoughts on my biology.
Okay, so this question is very interesting. This is constantly negotiated at the local level. I'm rightly this contact that I've done a lot of research in Chiapas as well, where there is not recognition of autonomy, but there is effective power of the indigenous communities and often a parallel system of justice. So visiting, for example, indigenous tribunals and interesting differences in the way laws are enforced. And what I learned is that there is constant negotiation. The state is always imposing some limit, and the communities are fighting back, but they have to really abide by some limits. Otherwise, the state can really encroach on them. So one example is I don't know if you know about religious expulsions in Chiapas. So communities are not autonomous, but still they're heavily Catholic and they expelled all the evangelicals. And it was a really huge violation of human rights. It took place for around 12 years. And then the local human rights commission constantly negotiating with the communities until this problem is no longer so relevant, right? Similarly, with the Pact of Living, participating, the state of Oaxaca changed its constitution because of constant push, both back and forth from members of the community, but also outside. So what I really observe is that this has to be negotiated. You cannot just resolve it with one legal code, and that traditional institutions evolve. which is something very important. Yes. So, yeah, and then the question I was thinking today about the theory. So I think like there are two elements. One has to do with accountability of local leaders, which is really the mechanism of capturing. So in party controlled municipalities, there is some form of elite capture of the municipality, especially the cabecera, which is the center of power. So that's one mechanism. And the other is this collective action that they obviously have social capital, but they have all the laws, internal regulations that enforce the participation. So for example, if you get drunk, I mean, that sounds like a very stupid deviation from the rules, but if you systematically do that, they can impose sanctions. Very serious crimes, you can get expelled. A lot of sanctions are monetary. And I think the question that you're addressing is interesting because one is collective action, the other is recruitment. And I now was generating other relations, which is very interesting. You look at the age group of youth, most of municipalities seem to be more effective at deterring the youth from coming by. So I think that it also goes through that mechanism. But I agree the paper needs, take different.
I think Maria and
I'm such a fan, and it's really great to see the presentation of these results. So exciting. My thinking was along Andres' line and the answers that you gave to Mary in thinking about the implications of this and sort of related to some of my own work. I wonder whether you could tell us from your qualitative interviews and just from your understanding of these contexts, how much of like what's happening in Chiran and this like effectiveness and social embeddedness and having to fight to sort of generate this sort of set of institutions and expel the cartel, how much does that process matter? So if we were to extend this to other contexts where like that wasn't required, would you expect the same or something different? And it would be really cool. I know for the purpose of identification, you want to match and compare it to other municipalities that are similar, but if you could tell us what's different about these places, and is it something not just about isolation, about like remittances, right? Like why is it then, or is it having been Pueblo de Indias, like are there some sort of necessary conditions that produce these? I'd just be curious to know what those are.
thank you. Mayor?
You mentioned a Saakashvili kind of reform where you just fire the whole police force locally. It's kind of tempting to think about that nationally and get back to Larry's question about scaling up. Police as agents of cartels, you can see how that would easily happen. Also trying to imagine what it would be like to be a judge in a violent community. Alberto and I were just at a conference where we talked about the federal judiciary, lots of fancy empirics and the like, but we were talking about the state judiciary and the real levels of violence that are faced at the local. And surprise, judges are complicit in cartel activity too, for a lot of reasons, including personal safety. So it kind of makes me think how traditional interventions and institutional reform aren't going to work in this environment. So what more do you think this?
Yes, very interesting. It's very interesting. Every president has been tempted to go around police because they know it's a federal system. So again, it's like every state, every governor, even every municipal president has a particular negotiation, right? That you never know who is who. So it's a complicated institutional setting to get any reform to truly happen because it has to be local. It cannot be federal, but every president has been tempted to go around this problem. And so, for example, Calderon, by bringing the armed forces into the district, and this created, we have other work showing how much what he did is really escalated violence. So that didn't seem to really be a solution. The current president followed a similar strategy. So he promised something different. And when he arrived to office, like understood the dilemma. So he said, okay, now it's not going to be the armed forces, but we're going to create this new police force that is called La Guardia Nacional. And they depend on the military. But interestingly, very little has been done on understanding how they behave. I've seen some data because, as you know, I work on torture, so I've seen that they behave differently from the armed forces, although they follow the same line of command. They seem to be better behaved. And so I think it's a very interesting, important question. In Mexico, everybody has been very worried about this and the policies of AMLO because it has given so much power to the armed forces, not only in the provision of security, where they are involved now in building airports, building trains. They have so much power. But this is a very interesting question in terms of how maybe you can create an institution like the Guardia Nacional that might be working a little bit different from the armed forces with a different ethos and much better. It seems like the federal police that was very much infiltrated before. So I got a little bit frustrated with working with the government and trying to understand this institution. That's why I started to work on how communities respond. Because also they're very reluctant to share information, to really be open to learning and or a dialogue, which has been really frustrating for my work. So that's why I started pursuing. Well, it's totally what I like. But it's remains a very important question. Yes. No, perdón. No, perdón. Yes, I think the question about Chedab, the process itself is a really interesting one because I received two critiques. One is like, oh, they have to have the same exact social capital to work. And what I observed in Cheran is actually very interesting. The parties had really divided the community. It's very indigenous community, but all these traditions were really dormant. And the parties have really introduced divisions. So the community was not that capable of mobilizing until they did. And I think the bonfires that I described, they do tell me that served to make the community more cohesive. So in the process of resistance, they became more cohesive. And also what is fascinating, which is a different topic, is the indigenous identification. So much increased. Yeah. And so you see all these young indigenous people in the community with this pride and this, it's super interesting process. So I agree, it's worth thinking about. I mean, they always challenge me with this social capital, and it's really hard to capture this. But completely, you're right on this. The process of resistance also promotes community, right? Yes.
This is for you, Catherine and Amanda.
Mine's probably a quick question because I kept sitting here thinking, okay, so they govern better. That's the bottom line, right? There's less violence, fewer murders.
Yes.
Things seem to get done. Right. Okay, so as I thought about this, I way back wrote a book on local governance and why this works. And yes, it can be a social capital issue, constantly collusion between elites. But is this really that they're indigenous so much as, is there something inherently different about values within this community than simply the fact that they're small? They're, I'm assuming, ethnically homogeneous, right? And they sort of contain geographic space. So this is sample in some ways, maybe. And so they govern better. So is it that they're indigenous or just those facts?
Yeah, it's super.
Can we highlight Amanda's question? Amanda.
So this is related to questions that were asked before about mechanisms, I guess I'm curious about. But it sounded, I wondered if you could say more about the nature of the relationship between party controlled governance and the cartel. So it sounded like you were sort of alluding to, like, from the perspective of the bureaucrat, right? Why do I cooperate? Maybe I'm afraid, or there are financial incentives, or I'm actually just sympathetic. And I was sort of, I'm just curious to hear about sort of what's your sense of like which of those are the most important, or just vary across different sort of arms of the government versus this one? Right.
And this really, goes back to the tightening the area and business. So let me answer first. Yeah. So it's very interesting. We're comparing against small and equally indigenous. So it's within that universe.
Yeah.
So it's not really size, and it's not really that they are less or more indigenous. So it's comparing similar type of community.
And ethnic homogeneity is more or less constant across.
So it makes some homogeneity, and Bert and I are working now on a different project. When we are, it's going to come. Yes, we're working on that question. But let's say we are really having very similar communities, so we cannot say it's really about size.
Yeah.
Or as they're indigenous or they're all indigenous. So, and the fact that we use indigenous is because this institution is only available for indigenous. So, for example, in Michoacán, when everybody started to get, okay, one of the things that they can get is direct federal transfer if you gain autonomy. And so, of course, that creates incentives for a lot of other communities to be autonomous, right? So they impose this criteria. It has to be an indigenous tradition. So there are 4 indigenous nations within our communities within Michoacán, and you have to have a consultation that the entire community approves of this. So that's why I compare with it's basically an institution that is available to indigenous communities, but it also raises the question of whether you can make it travel to other communities, right? And I've heard questions about this even from I work in the Catepec, which is a very vibrant municipality. And Sarah, who's here, a PhD student. We are working on an intervention in the Catepec that is a very vibrant municipality. And members in the community have asked me, why could not this apply here if the community has this sort of organization, social capital? So this is a really interesting question, whether you can make this travel and what problems it could create for order. At some point, everybody goes on their own, right? I don't know what this hearing says, let's see. But here, this is very much about indigenous peoples. So that's why I figured out indigenous autonomy. And then about the party control. So again, the first mechanism has to do with accountability. So what we notice in our field work is that when parties participate in the selection of the municipal president, again, only focusing on highly indigenous municipalities. So where really you see this amazing tradition. So they come dressed with a specific, very beautiful dresses, and then the police has varas, which are, I don't know how to translate these, sticks, and they come and they show themselves, and they really have significant power. But the president is elected through the party system, and what I noticed is a lot of elite capture there. So the community organizations, indigenous community organizations, do not have the power that they have when they actually can have control of the local government. They don't have control of the resources that comes from the federation, and they are quite significant. And so this is this problem of elite capture that I see more in small indigenous municipalities that have part.
So we have 5 minutes left. We have 5 questions on the. I'll take my time. We have 4 questions on the queue. Would it be okay? The questions are going to be super short, sound bite. You mind if we just take all the questions and you can respond as much as you can? No pressure to answer everything.
Okay.
So let's go with that. Dinsha, Aisha, Ana, and Anant.
Thanks. So, political autonomy suggests violence. Have you looked at measures like education, learn coding, economic?
And then Aisha.
Yeah, my question is about the science of autonomy and more like the elite debates about
I was just wondering if you know something about how the policy of the federal government, in particular post 2006, how this relates to the local indigenous government. Do we see fewer federal law enforcement agents also post 2006 in the local communities, and it's to some degree not only protection from the cartel, but also protection from I don't know.
I was going to follow up on the same line here because, the economic forces you have are sort of the drug dealing, and then there's sort of the metrics for governance and law are more about, criminal and violence. But what's the context of, the economic resources of the community? Also, to what extent is the autonomy, expanding to other areas beyond sort of policing on the streets?
Very disciplined.
This is a discipline.
So, in terms of other measures, I reckon I wrote a paper some years ago about local public goods with this very similar strategy, not so much data, but similar strategy of how they distribute public goods. And we found very significant differences in terms of more egalitarian provision of public goods and more public. Also, we have some data showing that they are perceived as more accountable than the parties, the control of more municipalities. Now I'm thinking about also looking at environment and sustainability, because that would be something really interesting about forestry and how they relate to natural resources. So that's some of the outcome variables that we have looked at. Another interesting one is about gender. So we're also working on a project on gender-based violence, and we are looking at some data on this. This elite debate, that's really complicated, and I think it's really important. So Michoacan is fascinating. Oaxaca was fascinating when it happened, and I had enough space in the paper to cover it. Obviously, it's very important because if you are going to start this this institution, there is a lot of resistance on the part of the elites because they don't want to let go. They want to be involved in the selection of the municipal presidents. But thank you for the question. I don't know how we can fit it more hard paper. Pure action from the state is very interesting. I don't know who else, but as I showed with drug seizures, there is the same level of drug seizures. So to have that, you have to have the armed forces, but normally present. But now there is a really new data set that we can use that actually hacked the government, because we always have asked, where are the armed forces in Mexico? Nobody has ever given us data on this. There was a hack in by memories, and we are going to be able to know with precision. I think it's very important where the armed forces have been. This is a very important question. So, yeah, I mean, the question of the economy, I think there are questions that concern me about the economy and other aspects. One of them is that this is a very costly institution to sustain. As I mentioned, you have to provide services. Most of, for example, municipal presidents are not paid. So it's voluntary service, and this is the only way they have managed to keep corruption from invading the community. So it imposes a lot of costs on communities. So one of the things I'm thinking about is studying immigration of youth. So how much there are, sort of people escape this very sort of costly institution. And so that would be something really interesting to study. It's about how decisions of migrate might be shaped by these institutions. In our fieldwork, we did find a lot of people complaining about it's very heavy for us. We don't receive money. It's 2 years. So, for example, if you come from one of these municipalities to the US, you are still forced to provide your services. And if your family is there, they have to provide the services. And so it's a really very heavy burden, right? So obviously the state is not providing this. They are providing it, and they have to really, sort of enforce collective action in a way that is costly.
Well, thank you. So before we adjourn, I just want to say thank you for the meaningful and impactful work that you're doing. Thank you.